Okay, so we're going to look at, in this next lecture, nature in the city. So we're looking at the idea of what does nature mean and what's our human relationship to this. How does it relate to the history of the city and issues of the city? And there's been a long history of artists interested in the relationship between nature and the city. In landscape painting, photography, land art, public art have all dealt with the relationship between man and nature. And Hong Kong is a particularly interesting place to explore the relationship between nature and the city, being a tropical mountainous island with a highly urbanised and dense and concentrated population just in one part of the territory. So I just thought I'd start with a work made by artists in Hong Kong. These are actually two expat artists, Lawrence Gutierrez of Morocco and Valerie Porfay, who are actually of France, who have been based in Hong Kong since 1995. And they formed their multidisciplinary platform, the Map Office, where they mapped Hong Kong, and it was one of their research projects which led to this photographic series of images. This one in particular, this series is called Concrete Jungle, and it actually illustrated the lush jungle of the territory. So they actually photographed some of the really beautiful tropical plant life of the territory, but then at the same time they actually drew over the top of the photographs very fine white lines to emphasise man's role in remodelling, controlling and managing nature. And they also photographed, in some of the photographs you can see that there's quite obvious concrete structures that the plants are actually growing out of, and there's obviously been painted green to sort of fit in with the natural plant life. So it's just quite an interesting particular thing to the Hong Kong environment. Okay, so during the Renaissance we had artists such as Albrecht Dürer, who undertook serious studies of nature. And so prior to that, the medieval period, we had artists in ancient Greece and Rome also doing things like this. So many historic examples of artists looking at nature, and in the 18th century there is an amplification between artists looking at the human relationship between art and nature, the powerlessness of the human and also the awe of nature. So that was during the Romantic period, which you would have studied earlier in Art History in Theory 1. And that this awe of nature was framed as the sublime. And in admiring the awe of nature, artists were often drawn to the power of nature and how powerful it is and man's relationship with that power. And it is a viewpoint that we still sort of carry through in contemporary works today. I mean, sometimes when you look at contemporary work by people like Andreas Gursky, you see that he still, there is that sublime quality in his works when he is dealing with the scale of globalisation, but he's also sort of relating that back to sort of the scale of nature. Okay. And then just going back to people like William Turner, this is the burning of the Houses of Parliament. It was a series of studies based on a real event that he was present at, which was a catastrophic fire. So the subject is actually not the burning of the building, but rather the fire and the light. And the power of nature is what he emphasised, the spectacle and the physical being articulated in the painting. So that was what he was really interested in expressing. We also had writers such as Edgar Allan Poe, who was also a romantic artist, and he wrote about the sublime of nature and also the heroic quest. So Edgar Allan Poe was alive from 1809 to 1849, and he was an American writer, editor and literary critic. And Poe was actually known for his poetry and short stories, particularly tales of mystery and macabre. So he was a widely regarded central figure in Romanticism in the United States. And he was one of the country's earliest practitioners of the short story. So Poe is actually generally considered the inventor of the detective fiction genre, and is further credited with contributing to the emerging genre of science fiction. Agnes Denner's Wheatfield in Battery Park, which was landfill in New York in downtown Manhattan. So drawing attention to issues around food and energy and the impact of commerce and the ecological land use. And she called them misplaced priorities, harvesting the wheat she grew, and distributed it on her website. So it was no longer just about representing ideas around nature, but it was actually working with nature as a medium and working with the land as a medium. And ideas around ecology had changed by the 1980s, and people were starting, I think really in the 70s, these kind of ideas started to evolve, especially after, I guess, the hippie movement, where people became more interested in that relationship to nature. And so a lot of artists would have been influenced by those kinds of cultures. And people were starting to think about the earth as a whole system, that things that happen in one place can actually affect other places. So I'm sure in Hong Kong, after the whole Fukushima nuclear problem happened, people in the whole region were concerned about, and including Hong Kong, people were concerned about sea life and also the detrimental impact that was going to have on local produce. I actually, last time I was in Hong Kong, I actually met some Japanese migrants that had left Japan after that incident and actually moved to Hong Kong because they were very fearful about their future in that, living so close to that area. Okay, so Earthrise is one of the first images of Earth that emerged from space and was distributed through new forms of media. So when this image actually was produced, it was actually taken from Apollo 8, which was the first space shuttle. It actually really did have an impact on people because they started to see the globe as one ecosystem, because for the first time we were able to see what the whole Earth looked like. And there was a sense of network and in a time of troubled politics. This is 1968, so we're looking at an era where there was Cold War politics going on, so the world was divided into the left and the right, the communist and the capitalists. And Vietnam War was a big issue that was becoming an international issue, impacting on many countries, and not just the internal communities of Vietnam. And there was also a real sense of interconnection across the globe, which impacted on the public imagination in which we envisioned our societies. So people were starting to think in a more global way when this image was produced. And we also had flight at that time, so air travel was becoming more common and more accessible to ordinary people. So people were able to move across the earth in a much shorter period of time, and it didn't mean, for the first time, it didn't mean that if you went overseas that you weren't coming back for a long time. That was a really huge difference. My father left, he probably left from Hong Kong to go to Australia in 1958 with really no intention of ever really coming back to this area. And it was quite common. He didn't come back to Hong Kong for over 30 years in that time. So you basically, once you left, you were really leaving. You went by ship. It took 2 weeks to get to Australia. But there was this mentality that you weren't going to be coming back anytime soon. And then my mother came to Australia a little bit later, in a later period, was only 8 years on, but she flew to Australia, which took, only 8 hours or 10 hours or whatever it was back then. But because of her very different experience, she actually came back and forth quite a few times, much more so than my father, because she had different experiences travelling to Australia. So it really did, that period of time was quite fundamentally, brought about huge change in terms of the world and our distances, and it shrunk. The world really did shrink. Okay, and you're probably familiar with Joseph Beuys, who is one of the founding fathers of conceptual art. And this particular work, 7,000 Oaks, was developed by Beuys in 1982 for the documentary in Germany. And Beuys was always very interested in art as a way of initiating social change and environmental change in particular. He was actually a member of the Greens Party in Germany, so he was actually very politically engaged with environmentalism. And in this particular work, he actually regenerated a whole part of Castle with 7,000 oak trees that were planted by him and a group of volunteers that were involved. And he was always very interested in taking out art outside of the gallery space and into the everyday. And one of his key ideas was the idea of social sculpture, that sculpture can be socially engaged. And that was a big part of his work. He also believed that everybody could be an artist, and was a great big advocate for art education, actually. And apparently he was teaching at one of the colleges in Germany, and actually ended up resigning from, or actually was fired from his job, because he kept admitting students in for free, because he wanted more students to have access to art education. And the school, that didn't really work for the school because they weren't making any money out of the students. But, and it eventually led to him being fired from the school because of that reason. But he was very generous, and he tried to educate as many people as he could and get more people involved in artistic activity and artistic thinking. Okay. So this is another project by David Burrows. He's actually a Melbourne-based artist, and he actually took images of the Arctic and turned them into a stereographic kind of images, which are those 3D images that, those images that you see on those old postcards where they look 3D. They're called stereographic images, and they're like lenticular. They use kind of more than one image to create a 3D image. And he actually created a series of viewfinders which were located at Federation Square, which is right in the middle of the city, and so that you could look at icebergs in the middle of Melbourne. And it was all about bringing complete wilderness into a highly urbanised environment. And you would be standing in the middle of the city, but you felt like you were looking at these 3D icebergs. Okay, and this is just David's comments on his Mirage project. The goal of this project is to create a tangible sense of scale and dimension of a real iceberg, and for the viewer to question the spaces they observe, while simultaneously I aim to offer an experience playful enough to engage the viewer's curiosity and activate their imagination. And then this is the work of Pierre Puy, which had been mentioned in the first lecture. And Pierre Puy is really interested in the museum or the gallery as a site of investigation. And he doesn't think of them as sites of nature, but he looks at the nature that lives in these gallery spaces. So he makes people aware of that relationship with nature. So by drilling holes and actually leaving food for insects. He actually tracks them to particular spaces in the gallery, and then actually reveals that there is a whole ecosystem that exists within the whole building. And these galleries are usually open from 10 till 5 p.m. But the interesting thing about what he unveils is that these beings actually inhabit the space for 24 hours, 7 days a week, and they continue to live in the gallery space even though the gallery is closed. So he's actually very interested in that idea and how all these things interact together. And also perhaps really kind of unveiling to the public things that we don't think about, things that are there but we tend to not focus on, or they're basically so small that we don't see them, or we don't, we don't think about them. This is another work also by Pierre Huy on the MoMA rooftop, and it was actually a garden commission by him. And he was looking at the nature that lives, still looking at this idea of nature that lives in the galleries, but he deliberately was inviting insects to dwell in the exhibition. Actually this work is a bit different. But he is shifting the focus of the work back to the experience, and he was actually very much written about by Nicholas Beria, who was also the author of Relational Aesthetics. If you're interested in participatory work, that's one of the kind of key texts that you perhaps might want to look at, because it was kind of one that sort of set that idea of participation in art in the 90s. And rather than creating objects, he actually created this rooftop garden commission, and he commissioned artists to come in and create site-specific works on the rooftop. And the site was very interesting because it overlooked Central Park, and an installation was an aquarium filled with rocks and various shrimps. And with the paving, he actually pulled up quite a lot of the paving to actually reveal things that were going on underneath the paving. And they realised that there was actually shrimps that were living fossils underneath there, and some of these shrimps were, millions of years old species. So, he just found it really interesting. He treated it like an archaeology site, and that he was an anthropologist working in that site, and treated it like an ecological dig. And he was also interested in the way the weather and other conditions would actually impact upon that site and change the work. It's just another detail of the site. Probably wouldn't have been that exciting to look at, but the ideas were very interesting, I think. Okay, so this is a photograph of Central Park in New York in 1938, and just thinking about the site, this was the first public park in America, and it was artificially constructed, this environment. So there are many things in there that you actually can't see, but the scale, when you look at a photograph, you can't really see the scale, and you can't also see that it's all how it's all interconnected. So he was very interested in this macro-micro dynamic, and which is very similar to kind of Massey and her ideas around this idea that place is always changing and transforming. So that park wouldn't have been there before it was planned and put there. But then, it was actually put in there, and then you get this kind of whole other world of an ecosystem that gets created through the plant life and that attracts different animals and insects to that space. So this is a quote from Pierre Huy. "I prefer a situation that you have to navigate, that you cannot see or encounter all at once, that exists, yet is not always visible." So this is really quite telling of what he expects his viewers to see. I did see his work recently at the Tarrawarra Museum, which is in London, and he did actually drill holes into the gallery walls and had the ants coming out. And it was quite, you did have to spend time with the work, because when you go into the gallery you don't really know what, unless you know his work, you don't really know what you're looking for. And then you start looking around and you start realising there are things going on in the space, but it just takes a little bit of time. You have to actually spend time with the work, I think. Another quote from him: "It's a situated network of both heterogeneous and porous elements in a coactivity, a space, a garden, a set of coordinates rather than a monolithic object. So there is a certain expectation to create something spectacular up here, the rooftop, but I'm trying to find another perspective." So he's kind of going anti-monument, really, if you think back to sort of like the whole Rosalind Krauss and the sculpture in the expanded field concept. She talks about the anti-monument. So really he is kind of playing on that whole thing that art does not have to be an object that's placed out in public, that's obvious that it's art, that an experience can be art. And so this is also another piece by Pierre Huy, which he did for Documenta in 2012. And he actually found the remnants of Joseph Boy's work with basalt sticks, which were inserted into the ground with his trees, the oak trees. And he inserted his own work onto a statue in which a beehive had grown. So he actually kind of sort of encouraged, I guess, a work to grow and to transform. And I guess the point of his work was actually about allowing that work to kind of evolve and sort of to show us that nature kind of has its own way of doing things without intervention from people. Like, he probably set up the situation. It's much like growing a garden. Quite often you have to do a lot of work at the beginning and get it set up in a particular way, but then as it grows it changes and forms in its own way, and depending on your intervention of it, forms the shape of how it ends up being. So I guess he sort of focused on that with this particular work. So the Weather Project was a project by Oliver Ellison, who is the Danish artist that was mentioned earlier. But he's also been very interested in sensory kind of encounters. And in this particular work he actually did at the Tate Turbine Hall in London. Have many of you explored much of the art scene in London before? Then anyone travelled over there? No? Okay. But the Tate is a very interesting gallery where lots of great contemporary projects. It's worth looking at their website for reference to some interesting projects if you're doing research, because they do put quite a lot of documentation of some of the artists that they've worked with, and they've got some really great projects happening over there. Okay, so this was a site-specific installation. Mirrors were on the roof. Imitation of the sun was through frequency lamps. So that's actually a great big frequency lamp there in the centre. It was an immersive work, a physical sensory encounter for audience, and it was, there is something we experience and we talk a lot about. So every day we talk about the weather, it's how we relate to each other. There's an emotional connection to the weather. Quite often there's been lots of studies done on how cold and sort of grey weather impacts upon your mood and can lead to depression and things like that. And that's actually been, seriously studied by psychologists and how that has an impact. And certainly I'm sure you have at times felt when you have to stay inside that you don't, you feel different because you're forced to stay in. And And then I guess he is really interested in the city as a site of weather, and each city mediates the weather and has its own microclimate. So this is work by the Japanese artists Fujiko Nakaya and Shiro Takatani, and this particular work is called Cloud Forest. And Fujiko Nakaya is a sound artist and does a series of cloud or fog works. So she actually did one in Sydney not that long ago, but her father was actually a scientist and actually created the first artificial snowflake. So in her own work there's kind of often a personal reference back to nature, and she's interested in the phenomenological encounter with the artwork, the direct relationship between the artwork and the viewer. And the sound works are designed to be responsive through senses, and air is an empty thing, but it is full of temperature and can affect you in many ways. So it has a social and kind of political implication. I'll just show you, this is the work that she showed at Cockatoo Island, which was actually for the Biennale of Sydney, and it was actually a cloud work, and you actually walked through, it was actually in a tunnel that you walk through, and you would be immersed in the cloud, and that was actually the work. I actually got the chance to experience that work. It was really quite an interesting work. So she speaks about fog and why she's interested in it. Fog is physical and can totally immerse you, she urges. When fog obscures your view, invisible wind becomes visible. It transforms your everyday environment instantaneously into illusory time and space. And when you are inside, it is no longer a visual experience, but you use all your senses to grasp it. So Alan Sonofist is also another artist that who created this work, which I think is actually still there. It's sort of dated as 1965 to 2005, but I think it actually still exists because it's been handed to the New York government. But Timescape is the name of the work, and it's the history of the city through the ecological change and loss of indigenous species. So you see it a lot in introduced plane trees going to kill introduced carp in the Murray-Darling. That quite often happens in lots of places. And in this particular work, Alan Sonofist actually found the seeds of indigenous plants that were indigenous to New York, and actually planted this whole block and recreated the original plants that were growing in that area. And the park has actually become a living history. So, and it's actually become sort of like a living social monument, and it's a big park. It's still, I think it's actually still there, and you can actually visit the park if you want to. So it's a little sort of mini forest in the middle of the city. And it's actually probably quite relevant to you in Hong Kong, because nature is, you know, plants and, well, there are, I'm just wondering if, I'm probably quite sure that there must be artists doing interesting things with plants in Hong Kong. Do you think so? Or have you heard of any? No?
Some of classmates did.
Some of your classmates have been interested in nature?
She grows some plants in house.
Yeah.
In her home.
For art making, or just for
as an arts project?
As an arts project, yeah. Okay. Yeah, but it is an interesting, thing, especially because in Hong Kong you've got this very concrete sort of environment, and just looking at the treatment of plants is quite interesting in the city. So this is Alan Sonofist's comment on it. As in war monuments that record the life and death of soldiers, the life and death of natural phenomena such as rivers, springs and natural outcroppings need to be remembered. In a city, public art can be a reminder that the city was once a forest or a marsh. So that's actually really quite an, you know, sometimes it's surprising how easy it is to forget that. And, you know, I've been finding it really interesting living here out in this area, which is actually surrounded by mountains. And just because I'm staying up at the top, one of the top floors here, I'm getting a very good view of the mountains behind the buildings. And just when you're down on the ground, you would not really have that sense that you're in a natural environment at all, because it is so built up. And you know, it's just really interesting, just looking at that complete contrast. And as Alan Sonofis says, you actually sometimes forget that there was actually ever a forest here or a marsh, or you know, that there wasn't anything here. I think a lot about Shanghai and that whole Pudong area, which used to be, that was a swamp, wasn't it? Or it wasn't, they had to reclaim it all to build on that area, and it was just empty space before. But obviously there was a natural site there. They actually turned that into a megapolis. Okay, so Marc Dion is another artist that we've mentioned before, and he's really interested in living ecosystems. So objects used in science and cultural sites and sites of education. And in this particular work, he actually, the original context into it was put into a glass house, and he was actually interested in kind of like creating some sort of a coffin for a natural site, and sort of looking at a tree, so that you can see actually there's a tree being removed there that got put into a glass house. And he was kind of interested in how this tree creates a whole kind of ecology that is of, you know, networks of insects and other organisms. He actually speaks about this work and talks about that he thinks that one of the most important things about this work is that it's really not an intensively positive back to nature kind of experience. In some ways this project is an abomination. So we're taking a tree that is an ecosystem, a dead tree, but a living system, and we are recontextualising it and taking it to another site. We're putting it in a sort of sleeping beauty coffin, a greenhouse built around it, and we're pumping it up with a life support system, an incredibly complex system of air, humidity, water and soil enhancement to keep it going. And all those things are substituting what nature does. So yeah, it's quite interesting. It's sort of, I mean, there are quite a lot of ethical concerns around this particular work, because he did pull a tree out of forest and then actually brought it into kind of this Bavarian kind of context. And you do ask that question whether or not that was ethically the right thing to do in the namesake of art. And then seed banks. Seed banks are something that's become increasingly popular in the last couple of years, I guess with the rise of sustainability and environmental concerns, and also the loss of biodiversity. We actually saw at the Shanghai World Expo, did anyone go to the Shanghai World Expo a couple of years back? Yeah, a few of you did. Yep, I was there at it as well. I was in Shanghai at the time working on a project which was kind of related to the Australian component of the expo. But the UK pavilion actually created a seed cathedral. So actually there was 60,000 rods with 500,000 seeds which were lit up. And the cathedral seeds were critical to human ecologies. And there's a sense of transience of the role of art in relation to environmental issues. So they actually created this so that they could actually save all these seeds for future generations. And in moving on dirt on the water. And she was actually a scientist before she was making sound artworks, but in this particular work, she's kind of used her scientific knowledge to actually expand into like a sound artwork. And then this is a work by Globel, who it's similar to Mark Dion's work, where we have an Australian gum tree that's been ripped out of the ground. It's a 25-metre long tree, and I guess the idea behind this work was to portray a sense of urbanism in the environment. I'm not sure how audiences responded to that, because I think it would have been a little bit upsetting seeing a tree that was ripped out of the ground like that. Australians are quite protective of their natural trees. But this work was actually based on Tao Wang Ming's poem, which was actually about a man who left his rural home and went to the city, and due to homesickness had to return home. So anyway, the poem mediates on the urban-rural relationship and the mediation of death, and considering connections to nature and how people feel at home in a particular place due to their relationship with nature. So I'm sure you are probably familiar with that. I know of people that cannot, I've had people that have lived in cities their whole lives, and they've said to me, I'm allergic to nature, I can't go near nature. Whereas, there are people like me who want to just live very close to nature. I currently live in a house that backs onto National Park, and the backyard is on the side of a mountain, and you go into my backyard and you feel like you're lost in the forest. So it's quite interesting, isn't it, why people feel comfortable in certain places. So this work creates ultimately a space where people can sit and be present, and I guess really be confronted by death and nature, and perhaps think about that in their lives. People were actually encouraged to respond to it, and they were given paper and pencils to write their comments and actually talk about how they felt about this response. But also, because Globel is obviously a Chinese artist originally from China, from Fujian actually. So the work actually does reference the history of landscaping painting as well, where quite often the fragmented tree is referenced in some traditional works. This is another artist, Rebecca Mayo, who's actually a Melbourne-based artist, and she's actually someone I've worked with before. She's a very interesting artist. She's very interested in things like weeds and native plants and introduced species and the relationship between those, and all occurring in the urban environment. And in particular, she is there's a creek that runs through most of Melbourne, through the northern part of Melbourne, called the Merri Creek, and for many years it was kind of a creek that was not very well looked after. It was quite polluted, and it's only in the last, I guess, 20 years or so that a lot of Australians are starting to think about their waterways and thinking about how they can actually clean them up and be involved. So she's actually a very active member of the Friends of the Merri Creek community, and they're an active group that actually volunteer their time cleaning up the creek and actually, bringing back the plants. And Rebecca actually even there are sort of native plants from around the area where she's actually taken those plants and turned them into dyes. She's actually a textile artist. She's turned them into dyes and actually used those dyes into and made fabrics and with designs that are based on the plants that are found in that area, and then used that fabric to create things like jackets, like vests for the volunteers to wear while they're cleaning up the creek. She's also made tents and things like that, and part of her work involves walking the creek, and actually she takes groups to explore that environment and actually try and appreciate what is actually there, and look at how they can conserve it. And I'm probably sure that some of these things have probably happened in Hong Kong as well, where people have realised that they've just gone too far with the treatment of like waterways and things like that. I know that I was in Suzhou working a couple of years ago, and the canal areas, which is the heritage of the city, I was told that was treated like a sewer for many years, and people just threw out all their rubbish from their house into the canals. But most recently they've done a lot of work in cleaning up those kind of waterway spaces and realised that it's a really important part of their heritage. And the same with some of these places like the Merri Creek in Melbourne. So this is actually some of the work of Rebecca's. These are sort of things that she's created for the walks. So she's actually worn these gloves and also these leg kind of gaiters, I guess, that were actually dyed from the plants that were actually in the river, and also the same with the gloves. The designs are all influenced by that region. And then we've got this is another local Melbourne artist, Catherine Clover, who actually is very interested in, she's a sound artist, she's very interested in urban pests as well. Urban birds, seagulls, sparrows, crows, pigeons, birds, which are birds that are kind of universal in many cities in the world. And she's interested in their presence and how we try and ignore them in the city, and how they reveal certain values that we have about nature, that particular birds are okay but certain birds aren't. And you know, she sort of also is interested in their resilience, even though we try and treat them like pests and we try and get them out of the city. They are very resilient birds. They survive and they often adapt, and they you know, they actually are quite, they want to stay. And so she's sort of been really interested in how recording the sounds that they make and how we interpret those sounds. And that's actually her in Beijing a couple of years ago, making sound recordings of birds out near the Great Wall, actually. And she's also interested in the repetitious sounds that they make and how that forms a part of the rhythm of the city, actually. So in this particular work, she actually, this was at the, there's a Liquid Architecture Festival, which is a sound festival in Melbourne. She was actually part of that, and this is at the Mission to Seafarers building, which is this dome building here. And they often invite artistic groups to create projects for that specific site. So she actually did a performance work there. And that used to be a building where all the seafarers, when they'd come in, that they would actually stay there. It was accommodation and boarding for them, and sort of maybe a bit of a social space for them. But as seafaring is not as common anymore, that it's not used as much as it used to be. So I think they often offer it out to artists to use as a space. And she was very interested, because it's right near the sea, she was very interested in the kinds of birds and the ecology around that environment, and actually made a work that responded to that particular environment. And she actually did a sound-based performance on the sounds that they were hearing in the local area. And just to end on, just go back to Mark Dion, and he was mentioned in the introduction, and just back to the idea of seagulls, and but you said that in Hong Kong you've never really seen seagulls? Okay. These are very specifically a beach kind of, near the sea kind of bird, which I think is in Australia, and I think in America they have them as well. And they're quite vicious birds, actually. But people don't like them because they do chase after you and they try and eat your food. And the more urbanised the area is, the more vicious they get, the more people there are. I've been chased at Circular Quay in Sydney by seagulls while I'm eating my lunch, and they usually actually take your whole lunch. but it's quite interesting. I was in Darwin, which is a much smaller city, and they have seagulls there too, near the beach. And, but the seagulls were very tame there because there's not as many people, and they are more respectful of your space. But in a bigger city like Sydney, they show their authority. They show they own the space. But Mark Dion's really tried to maybe perhaps show a different side to what we commonly perceive of these gulls that we have. We kind of treat them as like rats of the sky, really. Yeah. Okay, so that is actually the end of nature in the city, and I think there's definitely some interesting issues for you as people from Hong Kong to think about. And I'm sure that you know, with the issues of sustainability and the environment becoming more prominent as we move into this 21st century, you will be thinking about these things a lot more. Okay, and so we'll just take a 5-minute break, and then I will screen the walking into the city lectures.